You know that feeling when you think you have a story completely figured out?
Oh, yeah. Like you have all the characters neatly placed in their little boxes.
Right, exactly. You've got your protagonist, your antagonist, the sidekicks, but then you stumble across a completely different perspective.
And the whole narrative just
It
flips.
totally flips on its head. The person you thought was just, the accomplice hiding in the shadows,
Mhm.
they might actually be the one pulling all the strings. And that is exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to our latest deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a heavy topic.
It really is.
Mm.
So today, our mission is to unpack a truly fascinating source text we've been analyzing. It's titled The Architect of the Epstein Estate and Empire.
Right.
And the central, frankly explosive premise of this text is that Ghislaine Maxwell wasn't just a secondary player or even just a willing facilitator.
No, the author takes it much further than that.
Yeah. The author argues she might have been the true mastermind, the actual architect of this massive, illicit, global empire.
It's a profound shift in perspective, really. And before we really get into the weeds here, I think it's crucial to establish our ground rules for this deep dive.
Absolutely. We need to be clear about what we're doing.
Exactly. We are dealing with an incredibly dark, highly complex, and intensely politically charged web of events. So our role today is strictly to be your guides through this specific source material.
Right.
We are just here to impartially report the claims, the theories, and the timelines exactly as they're presented in this text. We aren't endorsing these theories. We aren't taking any political sides.
We're just the messengers.
Precisely. We're simply ensuring a completely neutral, objective exploration of the ideas the author has laid out for us.
Exactly. We're essentially holding up a magnifying glass to the text to see what it reveals. And what we have on the table for you today is, honestly, a wild stack of information.
Oh, it really is.
We're going to look at some very rigid legal timelines, a highly restrictive and secretive last will and testament, a dramatic and frankly cinematic family history of extortion,
Yeah, that part is wild.
and some truly explosive theories about power, leverage, and revenge.
Well, to really understand the theory this author is presenting, we have to start by looking at the timeline.
Right. Let's ground this in reality first. We all know where Maxwell is right now. She is sitting in a federal prison cell on a 20-year sentence.
Which was handed down in 2020.
Right, 2020. For finding and grooming victims. And we all know the timeline of Jeffrey Epstein's arrest in July of 2019 and his death just a month later in August. That's the public narrative you see everywhere.
But what the public largely missed was a very quiet legal maneuver executed months before any of that happened.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the author points us to a crucial, heavily guarded document, Epstein's last will and testament.
Yeah.
And this will was signed and executed in January of 2019.
Which is key.
Right. That is a full 6 months before he was even charged.
What's really fascinating here is the sheer level of control embedded within that specific document. The author highlights that this January 2019 wasn't just, a standard distribution of assets to loved ones.
Not at all.
It came with incredibly strict conditions. It granted the estate executors absolute ironclad control over his varied global assets.
Right.
They had total authority over any compensation to be paid out, any debts to be rectified. But the most critical detail the text focuses on is a very specific clause.
The one the author calls a poison pill.
Exactly.
Right.
Commonly known in legal circles as a poison pill.
And I love that term because it sounds like something straight out of a corporate espionage thriller.
It does.
But it's a real legal mechanism. How exactly does that work in the context of a personal will like this one?
Think of it as a financial self-destruct button. It's designed to enforce absolute compliance. In legal terms, it's often called an in terram clause. The clause dictates that anyone who challenges or contests the will as a beneficiary, but is not actually named within the document, will have their claim completely voided.
Wow. So it's basically a trap.
Essentially, yes. It's a massive intimidation tactic written right into the legal framework of the estate.
So if you think you're owed a piece of this multi-million-dollar empire.
But your name isn't explicitly printed on the list.
Right.
You can't even attempt to fight for it in court without triggering an automatic nullification of your claim.
Yeah.
You are locked out entirely.
So I want you to put yourself in Ghislaine Maxwell's shoes for a second. The text points out that she was widely known as the more prominent, internationally well-connected figure of the two.
Oh, without a doubt.
She had ties to royalty, politicians, billionaires all over the globe. The author suggests she likely felt she was the one who helped facilitate, network, and really build this massive estate. And then she sees this last will and testament from January 2019, and she realizes she is left with absolutely nothing from this empire she helped create.
Nothing at all.
Right. And at the exact same time, the federal walls are closing in. She's staring down the barrel of decades behind bars.
Which brings us to the source's most explosive speculation.
Right. What would someone with her level of influence, her level of international leverage, do in that cornered position?
And if we connect this to the bigger picture the author is painting, this is where the theory of revenge enters the narrative.
Okay.
Now, the text speculates, and we really must emphasize that this is purely the author's speculation regarding motive.
Right. Strictly the author's theory here.
Yes. The text speculates that facing the reality of being completely disinherited, cut out of the empire, and facing a lengthy prison sentence, she might have used her vast influence to exact ultimate revenge.
Okay.
The author theorizes that she could have ordered his murder while he was in jail, using her network of compromised individuals to have it covered up as a suicide.
Wait, hold on. Ordering a hit inside a federal facility, we're talking about the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York.
Right.
That is a massive escalation from just managing logistics and booking private flights. Does the author actually explain how she'd have the reach to pull something like that off from the outside?
That is exactly the friction point the text wrestles with. The author isn't presenting, a signed confession or a wiretap.
Obviously not.
They're presenting a psychological profile and a vast web of leverage. Look, if you've spent 30 years building an empire based entirely on compromising highly powerful people, you hold a lot of invisible IOUs.
That makes sense.
The theory hinges on the idea that her currency wasn't just cash, it was blackmail. The text asks us to evaluate her capacity for that level of orchestration.
Right. Could someone who managed a global abuse ring manage to bribe guards or manipulate schedules or blackmail officials?
Exactly. And the author argues the infrastructure for that kind of operation was already in place.
It's a staggering theory. And again, we are not presenting it as a proven legal fact, but rather looking at the motive and the means the text lays out.
Right.
If you are the architect of a shadowy empire, and the person you built it with suddenly cuts you out entirely while the feds are knocking on the door?
The text suggests you don't just quietly walk away and take the fall.
Exactly. You pull the levers of power you still have left.
Precisely. And that capacity for high-stakes manipulation brings us to the actual legal maneuvers she attempted when she was finally caught and indicted.
Right.
The source notes a very specific, desperate tactic she employed. She asked Donald Trump for a presidential pardon in exchange for information.
Which is just a wild detail to see in black and white.
It really is.
And again, keeping perfectly neutral here, we're just looking at what the source says about her legal strategy. But think about that. She genuinely believed she had information, leverage, that was valuable enough to trade for a presidential pardon. But let's take a step back. Why did she think she deserved protection in the first place? Why did she think she shouldn't be facing those federal charges at all?
Well, according to the text, her defense team claimed she should have been shielded by a completely different legal document.
Oh.
Epstein's infamous 2008 plea deal in Florida.
Right, the 2008 deal.
This is a critical piece of the puzzle, and it requires a bit of historical context. In that 2008 non-prosecution agreement, Epstein agreed to plead guilty to state charges.
Right.
And in exchange, his legal team secured an incredibly broad agreement that named co-conspirators would be exempt from federal prosecution.
He was essentially a blanket shield for the people operating within his network.
Exactly. And Maxwell's argument, apparently, was that she fell under that protective umbrella.
But there's a massive catch there, isn't there? A really tragic irony that the source points out.
There is. The irony is that Ghislaine Maxwell's name was not actually listed as a co-conspirator in those 2008 documents.
Wait, really? She wasn't on the list.
Not at all. And the source suggests this was almost certainly done intentionally as a protective measure for her back then.
Oh, I see.
The logic being, if her name isn't on the paperwork, she stays completely off the public radar. She avoids the immense public scrutiny and reputational damage of being officially linked to the crimes at that time.
So think of the 2008 plea deal like a VIP guest list at an incredibly exclusive, albeit terrible, club.
It's a good way to look at it.
In 2008, She didn't want anyone to know she was even at the club, so she made sure her name was left entirely off the list.
Right.
But in 2020, when the feds raided the club and asked who had immunity, she tried to claim VIP status.
But her name wasn't on the list she helped hide.
Exactly. It completely backfired.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Because she wasn't named to protect her high society reputation in 2008, she could not legally claim the immunity that the document provided when the real heat came down over a decade later.
She outsmarted herself. She was left entirely exposed. And this raises an important point about how she was ultimately brought down. It's a point the text makes very clearly.
Okay.
It wasn't the shadowy network that turned on her. It wasn't a betrayal by other elites that put her in prison.
No, it was the actual victims.
Exactly.
The charges that resulted in her 20-year sentence were brought directly by the survivors stepping up to the microphone. The victims themselves placed her directly in the center of the abuse, testifying about her role in recruiting and grooming them. And on top of that, the source notes she committed perjury during her own trial. So the downfall wasn't some grand conspiracy. It was the sheer weight of the victims' testimonies and her own lies under oath finally catching up to her.
Which paints a picture of someone scrambling. She's trying to use decades-old legal loopholes, floating presidential pardon requests, desperately trying to manipulate a reality that she could no longer control.
Yeah.
But to really understand her playbook, to understand why the author views her as a potential mastermind rather than just a subservient accomplice, we have to look backward, way backward.
We have to look at where she actually learned these tactics.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because her attempt to use that 2008 loophole shows a very specific kind of calculated, high-stakes maneuvering.
It does.
And if you're wondering where she learned to play that kind of shadow game, the documents actually point us back to her childhood. The source text takes a sharp pivot into her family history, specifically focusing on her father.
Yes.
The text explicitly describes him as if a financial crook. And it shares this bizarre, almost unbelievable anecdote that really feels like a foundational blueprint for everything she did later in life.
A very dark family legacy.
Yeah.
The source details a story where her father, who was operating as a massive media tycoon and corporate raider at the time,
Right.
sent a young Ghislaine to New York.
Yeah.
Her mission was to deliver a sealed, mysterious envelope to a particular business associate of his.
Just a simple courier job, right? Deliver
Yeah.
an envelope for Dad.
That's what it looked like.
Except, according to the text, that envelope contained an extortion letter. And not just any extortion letter. An extortion letter to the tune of $200 million.
$200 million. Let that sink in. In the corporate raiding era, that is an astronomical sum.
It's insane.
And her defense, according to the source, was complete ignorance. She claimed she had absolutely no idea what was inside the envelope she was delivering.
Plausible deniability.
Exactly. Now, the text notes that not much more of that specific story is known in terms of the business associate's reaction, but the aftermath of that event is chilling.
You know, most kids get a paper route or have to mow the lawn for their allowance.
Right.
Ghislaine gets sent across the Atlantic with a $200 million extortion note. Talk about a twisted family business.
It really was.
But the timeline the source provides next is what really gets you. She delivers this massive extortion letter. And then 1 year later, her father is found dead in the water under incredibly suspicious circumstances.
Yes. Found dead in the water near his prized luxury yacht. And the detail the source includes here is almost too on the nose for fiction. The yacht was named Ghislaine, after his favorite daughter.
It's completely surreal. You have a father operating at the highest, most dangerous levels of international financial crime, corporate espionage, and extortion.
Yeah.
He uses his favorite daughter as an emissary for a massive threat. A year later, he's dead next to a boat bearing her name.
It's a movie script.
It really is. And what does she get from all this? From this massive, shadowy fortune her father supposedly commanded? The text says she inherited $80,000 a year upon his death, that we know of anyway.
$80,000 a year. When you contrast that figure with a $200 million extortion attempt, or the billions flowing through the Epstein empire later on, it's a relatively paltry sum.
It is.
It suggests a history of being incredibly close to massive illicit wealth and power, perhaps being used by it,
Yeah.
but not fully controlling it, at least not initially.
Right.
It's almost like the ultimate dark internship.
Okay, let's unpack that dark internship idea. Because how does delivering a corporate extortion letter translate to managing an international abuse ring? I want to make sure we're drawing the line the author is trying to draw here clearly.
Well, if we treat this illicit network like a multinational corporation, the author suggesting that Jeffrey Epstein was the brand.
Yeah.
He was the logo, the public-facing entity shaking hands at Harvard and the World Economic Forum.
The guy on the brochures.
Exactly. But every successful, sprawling corporation has an incredibly ruthless chief operating officer, the COO.
Right.
The COO handles procurement, logistics, human resources, risk management. In this dark context, the author argues she was the COO.
That makes a terrifying amount of sense.
Procurement was finding victims. Logistics was coordinating private jets and helicopters across international borders without raising red flags. Real estate was outfitting mansions in Manhattan and islands in the Caribbean with surveillance equipment.
And you don't just stumble into that skill set.
No, you don't. You learn how to compartment information. You learn plausible deniability, like claiming you didn't know what was in a $200 million envelope.
So what does this all mean? Let's tie this entire deep dive together.
Let's do it.
We're looking at a woman who grew up as the favorite daughter of a notorious financial crook, who learned early on how high-stakes extortion, secret deliveries, and plausible deniability work. A woman who is internationally connected, arguably far more prominent in high society than the man she supposedly just assisted.
Without it, yeah.
A woman who, when cornered by a restrictive 2019 and a failed 2008 plea deal loophole, scrambled for presidential pardons. And according to the text's theory, may have possessed the leverage to manipulate events inside a federal facility.
The source is asking us to synthesize all these disparate data points into a cohesive profile. When you consider her lineage, her connections, and her ruthless legal maneuvering, the traditional narrative of the subservient, brainwashed accomplice starts to fracture heavily.
It really falls apart.
It does. And the text concludes by exploring a paradigm-shifting thought. What if Ghislaine Maxwell wasn't just facilitating this global empire? What if she was the actual architect?
I want you to really imagine the sheer scale of manipulation required here. Imagine maintaining a vast illicit network.
It's immense.
You're identifying targets. You're managing logistics, securing properties, managing staff who are bound by non-disclosure agreements. And you're doing all of this while mingling with royalty, politicians, and billionaires at galas.
Hiding in plain sight.
Right. You have to appear entirely legitimate, charming, and indispensable to the outside world while internally managing a web of leverage, secrets, and coercion. That is not the role of a sidekick who just goes along for the ride.
Not at all.
That requires a mastermind.
It requires someone capable of, as the text puts it, hiring and firing the ringleaders. It requires someone who understands how to operate in the gray areas of power, much like delivering a sealed envelope without ever officially knowing its contents.
Right.
The author is positing that Epstein may have had the money, but Maxwell had the blueprint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The plausible deniability. The invisible hand guiding the operation while letting someone else take the spotlight, and ultimately letting someone else take the fall.
To summarize what we've unpacked today from this source text, we've looked at how a strict January 2019 with a brutal poison pill clause might have provided a motive for ultimate revenge and self-preservation.
Yeah.
We analyzed how a calculated omission from a 2008 plea deal designed to keep her invisible ultimately left her exposed to the brave victims who finally brought her down.
Which was her real undoing.
Exactly. And we explored a dark family history involving a $200 million extortion plot and a mysterious death at sea, which seemingly served as her training ground. Bringing all this together fundamentally shifts the perspective. It asks us to look past Epstein as the sole mastermind and seriously consider Maxwell as the potential overarching architect of the entire operation.
It completely changes how you view the architecture of power and secrecy, which leaves us with one final lingering thought for you to mull over.
This is the big question.
If the true architect of an illicit global empire is someone who relies entirely on absolute secrecy and leverage, someone who learned the trade from a $200 million extortion letter, someone who tries to trade secrets for presidential pardons.
What happens next?
Right. What actually happens to that vast network of powerful ringleaders once the architect is finally locked away for 20 years?
It's a chilling thought.
Does an empire built on blackmail, IOUs, and leverage actually collapse when the builder is gone? Or does a new, unseen architect simply step out of the shadows, pick up the blueprints, and quietly take over the operation?
Something to think about.
Definitely. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.